This car is a little bit low on refrigerant. If you take a chart like this, which is a temperature pressure chart, you get your outside temperature, which is 65 degrees, and then it tells you what your low pressure gauge is, which is the blue one, and then also your high pressure gauge, where that should be, and that's going to be your red gauge. Whenever you set up the manifold gauges, you have the low side hooked up to the low side of the air conditioning, and the high side on the high side with both of those couplers open. And then only on the manifold gauge, the low side gauge is going to be open, and then the high side is going to be closed. You don't have to worry about mixing up the high side and the low side because the connectors that they fit onto are completely different sizes. On our chart, if it says that it's 65 degrees out, on our low pressure gauge, we should see pressures between 25 and 35. We're a little bit above 25, but we're at about 31. And then the high side over here, the red gauge, should be 135 to 155. Right now this is at about 100 psi and we want it around 130, so we're gonna add a little bit more refrigerant. So far we've put in about 1 can. It was pretty low on refrigerant and that brought our temperature down. First it was blowing 80 degrees down to about 50. We're gonna add a little bit more until our pressures are correct and then we'll stop. This is the empty can that we just finished using, and anytime we start to use a can we write "some removed" on it, so you always know that if you take this off, there's not a full can in there, which could mess up your measurements. So I'm going to close up the valve and put it onto a fresh can. Before we can unscrew this can, we need to close up the low side of the manifold gauges, and that'll keep it from hissing out. There will still be some pressure inside the can, and that hiss is going to be called de minimis release. There's probably just a few psi left in here. So then we'll take that out, and because there's a Schrader valve, there's not going to be much of a de minimis release as well. Then we'll screw on a fresh can. Then bring your valve all the way down. You'll feel the can get cold as the pressure starts to go in. And then once you feel it stop, I like to bring it up maybe a turn and a half, because at the very bottom, where it's bottomed out, it likes to hiss out a little bit. In this place, it's sealed. We want to put the correct amount of refrigerant in the system, or at least have an idea of how much we're putting in. So this is an old empty can with no refrigerant in it. We get an idea of how much that weighs. That's about 3 ounces. And then we're going to take our fresh can, put it on there. It doesn't have to be fancy. This scale just barely works with that amount. And then on your car, sometimes on the hood, ours is right here, it tells you how much refrigerant you're going to put in the system. This says 1.89 plus or minus 1/100th of a pound. So we have an idea of how much we want to put into the system. We're just looking at the pressures, but we want to be in this threshold of how much refrigerant we're putting in. Up here in the German section, I'm assuming this means charge, like it does in English, and then it says 900 plus or minus 25 grams, which is your tolerance. So this is going to be 900 grams plus or minus 25 grams. Typically in a can of this size, there's going to be 12 ounces of refrigerant, or 340 grams. So use that as your reference, and then only add that much more of the new can that you're putting in. You're only going to add that amount of refrigerant if you're adding it to a completely empty system. So that is the amount of refrigerant in a completely full system. So if you just changed the compressor and you were recharging the system, you would put 900 grams of refrigerant in. Whenever we first hooked up the gauges, we were at about 10 psi, and then now we're up at about 30. So we're just topping off the system, we're not completely recharging it. Whenever you're charging the system, you want to make sure your can is upright rather than upside down. Whenever the can's upside down, you're going to have liquid refrigerant coming through the line and then down into your AC system, which isn't good for the compressor. Whenever you add a fresh can in, you want to bleed the system here to make sure there's no air in the charging line. Just like that. Now we'll open up the low side. You'll see pressure starting to go up a bit. And then this will slowly start recovering, going down, and then the high side will start climbing a little bit. There's 2 different styles of cans. You need to be careful which one you're going to use. You can see this one has a little green Schrader valve in it, so that way you can disconnect it and not have all of your refrigerant come out. And this is the old style, which used a sharp piercing valve to pierce through a thin piece of metal. And there was no way to seal this can once you've pierced it. So if you have an older tool, you need to check to see if it has a sharp piercing point. If it has a flat end to it, then it'll work with one of these. Now they make adapters so you can use one of these piercing valves with one of the new style cans, but you can't take one of these old style and put it on the new style can. You can see some of the refrigerant has gone in. It was all the way down at the bottom and it's now much higher. So we've gotten some refrigerant in there. And then our pressure up here at the low side is at about 115. And our temperature is a little bit colder than 65. It's probably about 61. So we aren't expecting to get the full 135, maybe a little bit lower than that. And inside we're reading about 42 degrees, so we'll call this topped off. We can go ahead and take off the can, so we're gonna close up the low side of the manifold gauges. We'll pull it off the scale and bring this all the way up so it'll close. Now we can unscrew this brass fitting. Expect a little bit of pressure to hiss out. We'll close up our high side and the low side. Pop off the high side and there's gonna be some pressure, so it'll be a little bit harder to push. And the low side. Remove the valve and nothing will hiss out because these new style cans have that Schrader valve and we can keep the remaining refrigerant. Measuring it on the scale just to see how much refrigerant we have left in there, it looks to be about 8.5, but we're gonna also take an empty can and get the weight of that, which is about 3 ounces, and then we'll subtract it off of this. 5.5 ounces left. And it's nice to have cold air again. Recharging the system isn't very complicated, and it's important to look at your pressures rather than just adding refrigerant to the system blindly until it gets cold. You want to get it correct, not add too little refrigerant or too much refrigerant. The right amount is where it's going to function best. So I hope you guys found this video useful. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.